evening, I want to welcome you once again to our study of the Bible, the Word in a Year. So this evening, we're moving on to two more of the prophetic books of our Old Testament canon. We're going to be looking tonight at the books of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations. So both of these books, they were written by a prophet who was named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, he was an Israelite priest who lived and worked in Jerusalem. And it was happened during the final years of the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. So he's often referred to as the weeping prophet. And the reason is because of his lamentations of the nation of Israel and for the city of Jerusalem. Jeremiah's call was to warn Israel of the severe consequences of their breaking the covenant with Yahweh through both idolatry and also at times injustice. So like Isaiah, he also predicted that Babylon would come destroy Jerusalem. And in this destruction, he would take away those who were in Jerusalem off to exile away from their homeland. Unlike Isaiah, though, Jeremiah personally witnessed the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem, along with the exile of the people away from Jerusalem. So this book comes about a bit strangely. It reads much like maybe an anthology of sorts. And that's because it was collected and pieced together by a scribe who was named Baruch. Jeremiah 36, if you read that, it tells us that after 20 years of preaching and teaching in Jerusalem, prophesying, Jeremiah, he sensed God prompting him to collect all of his writings and then to put them together in sort of a collection. So Baruch was the scribe who was charged with compiling this material and then also piecing it together and placing it into a scroll. So what we have today is the compilation that was done by the scribe named Baruch of all of Jeremiah's material. So the big idea of this book is that God has not abandoned his people or his promise of providing a future king from David's line. It's kind of the big idea throughout the entirety of this book. And when we look at this book, it's a bit of a somber look at Israel's past with hope to the future. So there's three primary parts to this book, if you kind of break it up. The first part is the accusations and warnings of judgment. If you look in chapters 1 through 25, we discover the calling of Jeremiah to be a prophet to both Israel and to also the nations that surrounded Israel. His words would both uproot and tear down, but also at the same time plant and build up. In other words, he was to warn Israel of their impending destruction. But he was also to give a message of hope for the future. So all of the writings in this section, they happen prior to the exile of Judah to Babylon. At the core of what Jeremiah tells Israel is that they have broken their covenant with Yahweh. And they've done this by violating it in a number of different areas. The two primary areas we want to talk about, the first is that they adopted the gods of the surrounding nations. They gave into idolatry. Shrines have been built throughout the land to worship the false Canaanite gods. And rather than worship the true God, rather than worship Yahweh, they compromised and they began to worship false gods. The metaphorical language that was used by Jeremiah is that of prostitution and also promiscuity. He says that Israel, they have been unfaithful to Yahweh and they've lusted after the gods of the land. The second thing is that the kings of Israel, the leaders of Israel, have become corrupt. The kings, the priests, the prophets, by and large, they've abandoned the Torah and the covenant. And it's led to rampant social injustice. The widows, the orphans, the immigrants, the most vulnerable of society, they're being taken advantage of. And all the while, Israel's leaders, they just kind of turn a blind eye to it. They remain silent. When we reach chapter 25 at the end of this section, we find Jeremiah's proclamation that because of Israel's disobedience, the nation of Babylon, with their king Nebuchadnezzar, they would conquer Jerusalem. And that Nebuchadnezzar, he would take them into exile for 70 years. So Babylon, they're compared to a cup of wine that's filled with with God's righteous anger, his wrath at Israel's idolatry and injustice. So as a result, Israel and the surrounding nations, they will be made to drink from this cup. And from this point forward in the book, Babylon is a key component to Jeremiah's writings. The second part of this book, it focuses on stories of disaster and a message of hope. So this section, it contains a number of various stories relating to the disaster that awaits Israel. Despite the constant rejection by Israel's leaders of God, the people are called to repent, even up to the very last minute. And this section, it concludes with stories about Jerusalem's siege and also its eventual destruction, and how Jeremiah, how he himself was even persecuted, how he was kidnapped, and how he was taken against his will to Egypt with a group of Israelite rebels. But in between these dark stories, there's hope for the future. We can't miss that out on all the doom and gloom. There's hope also in this book. Jeremiah, he develops Moses' words about Israel breaking their covenant with Yahweh, but he says also that Yahweh would not abandon them. So in spite of Israel's disobedience, in spite of all of this stuff that they had, that they turned away from God, God would be faithful to his promises. So the final part of this book, it centers on judgment from Babylon and exile. So Jeremiah describes how God will use Babylon to judge the nations that surround Israel, including Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Edom, Ammon, Damascus, and also Hazor. But just as God would use Babylon to judge the nations around Israel and Israel itself, Babylon themselves, they too would be judged. Babylon appears to be this larger-than-life character in these poems. And its character is this archetype of all the rebellious nations on the earth. In spite of its size, eventually God will give the Babylonians, he'll give them over to their own destruction. And the conclusion of this book, it tells the same story that's found at the end of 2 Kings and 2 Kings 25 with Babylon's final attack on Jerusalem. And the story shows that Jeremiah's warnings, his predictions, that all happened all the way back at the beginning of this book, in the first part, they vindicated him as a true prophet. This book shows a number of different things. The first is that there are true consequences for sin. You know, sin is something that God takes seriously. He doesn't take it lightly. And there's forgiveness for sin when we turn back to him. But sin is something that must be dealt with. And for the nation of Israel, their sin eventually led to their exile and also the destruction of Jerusalem. The second is that God is faithful to his promises. In spite of everything that Israel had done, in spite of the fact that they had completely turned their back on him, God was faithful to his people. And although they would be exiled for 70 years, there would come a day when Israel would return to their homes and they would turn to their land. So that wraps up the book of Jeremiah. But like the book that bears his name, the book of Lamentations, it was also written by the prophet Jeremiah. So this book, it remains anonymous, but a number of different scholars, they truly believe that Jeremiah was the one that penned this book. He penned this in addition to his the book of Jeremiah that we currently have today. And this book contains 5 poems from the perspective of an individual who survived the siege of Babylon on Jerusalem. And they're reflecting back on the fall of Jerusalem. And the fall of the city of Jerusalem, we have to understand, it was probably the most catastrophic incident to occur up to that point in Israel's history. There was so much promise that was involved with this land. You know, this land was the land of promise that was made to Abraham. And to be exiled was to feel cut off from that promise. So this book, it serves as a memorial to the pain, a memorial to the confusion of Israel following the destruction of the city. And one of the biggest things that we can take away from this book as a whole are how prayerful lament, it's a crucial part of our journey of faith in a broken and a hurt world. Lamenting, it's not unique to just this book. It can be found also in the Psalms. We talked about that a few weeks ago, several sessions ago. We talked about how some of those Psalms were lamenting Psalms. So lamenting, it's a way to draw the attention of others, even including God, to the injustices that are happening maybe in our own lives, maybe just in the world surrounding us. They're a way of processing our emotions, if you will. And finally, they give voice to our confusion. One of the interesting things about these letters, these poems that are found in chapters 1 through 4, they're made up of acrostics, alphabet poems, if you will, in which each poetic verse, it begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which consists of 22 letters. So in a way, you could say that when we read these, it's almost as if Israel's suffering, it's being explored A to Z, beginning to end. So the various poems in this book, they explore topics like grief, shame, and trauma. But they also offer hope for justice in the middle of all these other emotions. The final poem in chapter 5, it's a bit unique in that it breaks the design pattern of the previous 4 poems. And it's a long communal prayer for God's mercy. And it's like the author, he's just ready to pour out everything that he has before God. And that's something that we can learn from in this book. It's the invitation to pour it all out before God. You know, that's the beautiful thing about serving God and the beautiful thing about prayer. We can approach God with everything that we have, and we can lay it all at his feet. We can lay the joy, the sorrow, the celebration, the anguish. We're invited to commune with him every day and pour out everything before him. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next session.